So the primary responsibilities of the school board are policy, managing budget, and hiring superintendents. There's also a community aspect where the school board members act as a liaison to the local community and local districts and local schools. And I look forward to serving in that capacity. So the total approved budget for this year is $492 million. I've never managed a budget that size. Perhaps at some point in my personal life I'll have the benefit of doing that. Currently in my capacity with Amgen, my partner and I manage a revenue responsibility of $35 million. The decisions that I make on a day-to-day basis impact that budget. I also have to manage expenditures. When I've served in various other boards, we've had arguably a smaller number, but there were also a smaller number of people on those boards that manage budgets. For example, when I was on the vestry at St. Mark's, we had a multi-million-dollar budget, and the budget decisions that we made, sometimes they were popular, sometimes they were unpopular. I've managed smaller enterprises at the executive level. Most recently, James Bayou Hunting and Fishing Club. It's Louisiana's oldest club of its nature, started in 1896. Some of those budget decisions were unpopular, but they ultimately paid dividends in terms of capital improvements and that sort of thing. I'm very budget conscious. I'm more of a macro person. I do look at the benefits versus the liabilities of expenditures. Expense requests have to be evidence-based. They have to be real world, and they have to have a benefit attached to them. I don't believe in spending money just for the sake of spending money. And unfortunately, in government enterprises, I've seen that as the case. When I sold medical equipment, there were times when I would get calls at the end of the year from various public health units who would tell me they had $40,000 to spend, and I would ask them what would they like, and the response was, "We don't care." That's extreme waste, and that galls me on every level. My goal on Caddo Parish School Board is to make sure that every nickel and penny that is spent for a good reason. Sure. So Dr. Gorey has a plan in place, and it seems to be bearing fruit. We now have 10 A-rated schools. That's up from 9. Some of the highest gaining schools are places like Stoner Hill, which is an underserved and lower income neighborhood. They're doing extraordinarily well. We need to make sure that programs like that are replicated in other schools and put in place. There's an X factor with some of these plans. You can manage the manageables, or you can coordinate the externals, but one thing that all these programs do not replace is compassion, expectation, community involvement, family involvement. We can run the school board like it's a machine, but you won't always get the results that you want. Nothing replaces families that care, neighbors that care, a community that cares. And one of the goals that I have personally is to get greater local involvement with each of the schools. So the medical portion of it, I have 20 years of healthcare experience. Some of that has been involved with insurance and reimbursement. I may have a unique perspective on that on the school board. I'm also aware of the fact that last year they were able to save $4 million locally on health insurance. So frequently there are opportunities to look at medicines that have similar outcomes but have significantly less expense. You can also look at wellness programs for Caddo Parish employees that also help drive down healthcare expenses. When you look at healthcare, 80% of the cost is lifestyle and behavior induced. So of that, if you look at cardiovascular disease, if you look at diabetes and other markers, if you encourage people to eat a little bit better, to have a little bit better lifestyle choice, you can see dramatic differences in outcomes. If you encourage that at a local level, I think what you'll ultimately see is a decreased healthcare spend. So that's a difficult question. We're now at 40,000 students, to my understanding, but we have an infrastructure for a much larger student population. We have to respond to that realistically. And in the business world, when you have half-staffed offices and your revenue goes down, you make choices. They're not always popular choices, but we have parts of town that are growing and parts of town that are declining, and you create a logistical issue by moving people all over to respond to that. I think there are some schools that make sense, and some schools that may have outlived their usefulness, but you also have to look at what the future looks like as well. And so there may be schools that are near downtown, and if downtown continues to show an increase in population, you may want to keep that in mind. Unfortunately, I think difficult decisions have to be made. And what I see on the school board, I see that people are aware of that reality and willing to discuss it as long as it doesn't impact their district. And I think at some point, those difficult decisions have to be made. So I'm fortunate in that District 4 has some of the absolute best schools in the state. When you look at South Highlands, where my two children graduated from, where my wife currently teaches, it is a phenomenal elementary school. When you look at Magnet High can compare to nearly any top performing school in the state and do extraordinarily well. Byrd is legendary. We have a couple of other schools in District 4. Stoner Hill, that was a failing school, but it's moving in the right direction. And then you have Cresswell, which has a strong legacy, but is struggling. With these types of schools, you can almost look at rebranding. And some of this would affect District 4, but some of it would affect the entire school board. And when I say rebranding, if you look nationally at some of the top ranked schools, I look at schools like Brooklyn Latin Institute. It's a public school. It's 14% white. It is 60% composed of indigent students, 86% minority. Of those minorities, it's about a third Black, a third Asian, and a third Latino. It is ranked number 5 in the nation. And what they have done is they've inspired teachers, they've inspired leadership, and they've inspired students to learn. And I think you can replicate that here because it's a similar demographic. They've allowed teachers to teach. They've taken the burden of some of the administrative pressure and testing pressure off, and they've encouraged them to be the professionals that they are. There's no reason why we can't see that in Caddo Parish. I would like to see some of the underperforming schools have a relaunch or a rebranding, and maybe look at having some of these schools relaunch as a STEM school or an integrated arts school or a classical academy that emphasizes Western values. There's no reason that it can't be done. And it would inspire people that may be sending their children to private school to relook at what our local education has to offer. I hold myself to a high personal standard. Much of that is, in fact, all of that is linked to my faith. I can't do anything that compromises my conscience because ultimately I'm the responsible of that. I'm responsible for that. There is frequently gray area, and when I'm presented with gray area, I err on the side of high morals and ethical standards. I can't think of a specific example, but just know that I've tried to live my life as honorably as possible, because jobs and titles and positions come and go, but your character and your reputation remain forever. So that's a good question, and I've touched on some of it before, but ultimately our schools have to be better and cheaper. And so when I say better, we need to continue to drive attendance, to drive graduation scores, to drive achievement scores, to drive community engagement, and to drive outcomes, and to manage all of those aspects that impact that. And when I say cheaper, I don't mean that in a negative, I mean that in a financially sound way. We have to face the reality of a declining population, but also realize that our biggest competitor is 300 yards to the east of us. Many of our people are not moving terribly far, they're moving to Bossier. And if we rebuild these schools and we do it in a way that makes sense, you impact the community in multiple ways. You build your tax base because people aren't leaving. You're inspiring kids to come out of school prepared to work and prepared to have careers. And if you look at the data, kids that are well prepared to earn are good citizens. They don't litter, they don't commit crime, they pay taxes. And all of those over time improve communities. So when I say cheaper, we have to face the economic realities, but we have to make sure that when we do that, we are producing a better product. And with a budget of $492 million, that's not an impossible task. No, just in general, know that, and for what it's worth, my motivation for this is my wife and children and my mother-in-law, who are all fully engaged in the Caddo Parish school system. I have 2 children that have at least 7 years left in Caddo Parish schools. They've done extraordinarily well in the schools and they've thrived, and I feel like it's prepared them for higher education and careers. My wife has not always, but has typically enjoyed her experience with Caddo Parish schools. She's taught at Moortown, she's taught at Riverside, and she's taught at South Highlands. And my mother-in-law has taught at South Highlands and has moved into administration. I feel like education's foundational, and I feel like it's one of the shining stars in Caddo Parish. I'll do what I can to maintain the good aspects of the school, but as the Bible says, the least shall be first. And when I look at District 4, the 2 underperforming schools are where I would hope to devote my energies and my focus to help them make sure that they have the resources and the support they need to grow. At the same time, I don't think raining cash on every underserving school is an evidence-based approach. We've seen spending on education more than double, and our outcomes are slipping. So that X factor that I mentioned earlier is where we need to put our energy. I don't have any axe to grind. I don't have any products to sell the school board. I don't sell school buses. I don't sell testing. I'm not angry with the school board. I'm not here to level any scores. For me, it's purely community service, and it's an opportunity for me to give back.